All right, let's escape out of this.
Upper right-hand side, X.
Oh, there it is. Thank you. Okay, so we're off to a roaring start here. So the other key thing there is natural hazards. And when we talk about natural hazards, something called the Stafford Act, which really kind of authorizes and gives us a sandbox that we're playing in within hazard mitigation planning, says that FEMA is interested in natural hazards and natural hazards only. They don't consider human caused or technological hazards when they are looking at and reviewing a hazard mitigation plan. That does not mean that we cannot put those hazards in our plan and discuss them. It just means that they're not required. FEMA also, interestingly, has a definition of what those hazards are in there. Now, they're very loose with that definitions, but it's interesting to think that extreme heat, for example, is not a hazard that is defined by that. We all, I would admit that extreme heat is a pretty big deal. And in fact, heat is one of the #1 natural hazard killers in the United States. But it's not enumerated in the hazard lists when FEMA is looking at that. However, FEMA has the chance to change those things. For example, transmissible disease was not considered as one of those natural hazards, but at the advent of COVID, they refiddled with some things and redefined some things and made that happen. So again, within the framework of this, we're very much interested in those natural hazards. And again, I talked about this hazard mitigation framework. We talked about the Stafford Act and the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, which amended it. But that is the framework for how we are completing your hazard mitigation plan. Now, interestingly, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and I'm sorry, I always spell out my acronyms because I'm sure we've all been in a meeting where someone drops an acronym and you're not sure what the heck it means. And you've got two options. You can say, what the heck does it mean? Or you can secretly Google it and hope you get the right one. So I beg your forgiveness on that. But FEMA, they made a reinterpretation of their guidelines recently. And what they've done is they put some added requirements in here. We want to make sure that we are playing within those rules so that when we submit your plan to FEMA, they approve it. If we don't meet all the rules and requirements, they will deny the plan. We'll have to come back. We'll have to do some rewriting and meet their requirements. And so one of the things for the past year that we've been very sincere about doing is learning what those requirements are. And more importantly, learning regionally how they are applied. Because they are applied a little bit differently throughout the United States, not wildly differently, but different regions are very, very interested in different things and really hammer different things. So we're going to be using this as our framework when we write your plan. Now, how do we think that hazard mitigation planning can help? We think that there's a litany of ways that it can help. We think, first of all, that a good hazard mitigation plan and a good program going along with that is going to build a safer future for everybody. The idea is we've identified what hazards can impact us. We've identified projects that we can do to make us all safer in the long term. It's better for the community. We think that it can encourage long-term resiliency. You know what your hazards are, right? If I ask you right now, I'm sure you guys would all come up with the same list. What we want to do is we want to become resilient against those hazards because with the advent of the climate changing, whether, you know, what the cause is, I'm not here to say, but with the advent of the climate changing, we're afraid that many of these hazards are actually going to get worse. We want to educate your citizens about the hazards and the actions that they can take themselves. There's many actions that citizens can take that will make them safer. And when they make themselves safer, it makes all of the community safer. And finally, we want to prioritize budgeting for hazard mitigation projects. One of the things is that many of the long-term projects we potentially would like to take cost money. And in order to do them, we have to prioritize the budgeting so that we can get the money to be able to complete them. And when I talk about prioritizing the funding, it's because of this. When you have an approved hazard mitigation plan, it opens up potential streams of grant funding. These are the three big ones. The first one is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And what happens with that is that after there is a presidentially declared disaster anywhere in the state of California, a percentage of the public and individual assistance gets sequestered into a grant program. And if you have an approved hazard mitigation plan, which you do now, you can apply for grant funding for projects under that program. BRIC is another big one. BRIC is Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. And what this is that every year Congress authorizes a big pool of money for the BRIC program. In 2002, it was north of $2 billion. And what they do is they allocate a small percentage of that funding to states automatically, usually a couple $1 million here or there, north or south of that. And then the rest of that is available in a nationally competitive pool, again, for those with an approved hazard mitigation project to apply for grant funding. And then finally, we have the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. And this is for repeatedly flood-prone properties. It's a funding program to do something with them, whether it's elevate them, buy them out and demolish them, whatever it may be. Now we talk about the budgeting with this because just like any kind of, money, there's always a catch. And the catch with these grant programs is simply this. There's a 25% local match required. So if you say, hey, we want to do $1 million project, the community has to come up with $250,000 of that project in order to make it happen. Now, there are some workarounds with that. There's the Community Disaster Resilience Zone, something called a CEDAR. And a CEDAR, you only have to do a 10% match. There's other things where your community may have a 10% match. But nonetheless, you still have to come up with a portion of that fee. Now, the good news with this is there's nothing in the guidelines that says that 25% has to be cash. You can do what we call in-kind donations. And I've seen many projects completed with this. If you have volunteer labor, that gets a dollar figure associated with it. If you have volunteer or donated equipment, dollar figure. If you have donated technical expertise, dollar figure. It is completely and utterly possible to complete hazard mitigation projects without laying any kind of money. But you have to think about it beforehand. And so when we mention this grant availability, it has to go along with budgeting. You have to have the funding or the capability in place in order to get that grant funding. Okay, goals and steps for the project. Uh-oh. We shut down unexpectedly here. This can't be good. See if I can stop sharing. Hopefully the PowerPoint is still there. All right. Let's see if you guys can see that. Can you see that online?
No, it's not online.
Technology, not always my friend. All right, let's see if we can do this again. Are we online still, Owen?
Yeah, we're still online.
Okay. See if I can share my screen again here. See if the PowerPoint comes up. There we go.
Yeah, we're
Okay. Sorry about that. Sometimes technology is not our best friend. So, our goals and our steps for the project. We've outlined 4 goals that we want to work for and hopefully achieve as we work through this planning process. Goal 1 is to reduce and eliminate or reduce the risk to people and property from the effects of hazards. That's the definition of hazard mitigation plan. That's why that's goal 1. Goal 2 is to protect vulnerable populations and critical infrastructure from potential impacts from these hazards. We're very big on being inclusive and bringing in potentially underserved and vulnerable populations. In fact, we've got whole sections of the plan devoted to that. The idea is we want to help and recognize folks that maybe can't help themselves. We also want to protect our critical infrastructure because that's, in general, our response infrastructure. And so we don't want any of our identified hazards to knock that down so we don't have a response capability. We want to work to improve public outreach initiatives, including education, talking about these kind of things, because we want the public to be involved in this. And finally, we want to work together better as teams. Unfortunately, most of the hazards that impact us here in the county don't respect political boundaries. It's not like a wildfire is going to blow up here in Wairika and it's not going to cross the city boundaries, right? It doesn't have that good grace. And so many of these hazards that we identify impact all of us in some way. And so we want to work together and more comprehensively as a team. Now, this is what we're going to do to complete the plan. We're going to review your previous plan. We've already done that. We read through your previous plan, and we're going to start pulling the information that is relevant to this planning effort forward. We are going to review the state of California hazard mitigation plan. We've done that. And we're going to pull relevant information from that into our plan so that we dovetail with the state's plan, so that we work and play nicely with them. We're going to review your new codes, regulations, and planning documents. How have you changed in the past 5 years? We're going to do your review your demographic and developmental changes. Have you grown? Have you shrunk? What's happened to you? We're going to talk about your potential risks, those hazards that we identify. We're going to talk about your vulnerabilities in your assets. What makes you strong? What makes you weak? We're going to talk about mitigation action items. And the simple definition of a mitigation action items is this. If someone handed your community a bag of money and said, go make things safer for the long term, what would you spend it on? That's what we want to think about as we're talking about hazard mitigation planning. Hey, we know that we're in an earthquake area. If we wanted to make it safer long term and someone gave us a bag of money, how would we do that? What projects would we undertake to do that? We're going to solicit public input. Again, today I have an initial survey that I'm going to release to everybody that says, tell us what you think. And along the way, we'll introduce another survey as well that says, tell us what you think. So we want to get that public input because this is an open public meeting. And I know I've got some members of the public online, but the more the merrier. And then finally, we're going to give you a draft to review, and we hope that you're going to look through it. So let's talk about who's helping us steer this, what we call the Hazard Mitigation Planning Committee. The idea with the Hazard Mitigation Planning Committee is that there are boots on the ground representative. They are our sometimes arm twister, sometimes our handshaker, sometimes our babies. And what we want them to do is we want them to be involved with this process. So we ask them to attend and participate in meetings. We ask them to assist with the collection of data. One of the things that we try not to do is inundate you with a million things. But if we do call you up and say, hey, can you provide us with this information? It's going towards the plan and making this plan stronger and better written. We're going to ask them to review the planning elements and drafts. Anytime before we release anything to the public, we're going to ask the Mitigation Planning Committee to take a first draft review of it and say, yeah, this passes muster with us. Let's see what everybody else thinks. We're going to ask them to assist with the revision and development of mitigation action items. Now, what FEMA will tell you is that they are very sincere about what a mitigation action item is. For example, if you said that you wanted to buy a generator, that's really not a mitigation action item because it's not a long-term fix. What they would say to you is, why don't you look at making your electrical infrastructure more robust in some way, right? That is a long-term fix. And we're not going to set you alone on that. We're going to provide plenty of examples of what mitigation action items are for you. But we're going to ask our Mitigation Planning Committee to help with that. We need them to champion the adoption of the plan when this is all said and done, and FEMA has given us what they call approved pending adoption status or approved status. That adoption step is the last and sometimes hardest hill to overcome with our participating jurisdictions. And what it is that your governing body, whether it be a town council or a mayor or whatever it is, has to adopt the plan, has to say, yes, we adopt this as part of us. That's the final step. And sometimes that takes some arm twisting. I'm 90% certain that in your last plan of 2018, you had some jurisdictions that participated, but didn't end up adopting. And if they don't end up adopting, they don't have any kind of coverage with this plan. And then finally, we're hoping to write a plan that can be integrated into other planning efforts. We're hoping that the information contained in this plan is useful across a wide range, and you can use this as a research and review document. Now, this is where we stand right now with our Hazard Mitigation Committee. We've got our county representatives from OES here, but you'll see all those jurisdictions underneath. Those are your cities and your districts around the county. And what we need is we need a champion from them. We need someone that's going to put their hand up and say, yes, I'll help out when asked. And yes, when the time comes, I will shepherd this through adoption. And so we're looking for that. We don't have to have the answers today, but we do need to have them, in the next week or two as we start working and reviewing on your plan. And so these are the folks that we're looking for. Okay. I want to talk about important stakeholders. Because while we want those MPC, those Mitigation Planning Committee members to be involved very deeply, we also want a wide variety of folks to be involved. We want entities working with our underserved communities so we can try to understand how they may be disproportionately impacted by some of these hazards. We want national flood insurance program administrators. Those are the folks that oversee floodplains and zones within your communities, because flooding is a big hazard. And we want to understand what they're doing and how they're doing it. We want to talk to building code officials, anybody involved in regulating building and applying codes. Because building codes is a very big component of hazard mitigation. A building built in 1950 is nowhere near, and this is of course rough, but is nowhere near as strong as a building built today. Because the building codes are applied and those building codes say, hey, are you earthquake resilient? Are you fire resilient? Do you have fireproofing in your building? Do you have hail resistant roofing on your building? Are your buildings built to certain wind codes? Building codes are a big deal and go a long way towards hazard resiliency, not only for our city structures or our county structures, but for every house in the county as well. And then finally, we want our citizens to be involved, because one of the things we do is we say, here's the direction we're going for the plan. Here's what we're doing for the plan. We want them to sanity check that a little bit and say, yeah, this is going in the right direction. Or have you thought about this? Because no one knows how they're impacted better than the folks out there, right? They know what's happening. They know what's going on. They know what hazards are doing to them. We want that feedback. And so again, we've got a whole list of important stakeholders. What we say is the more the merrier. We want as many people jumping in the pool as we can get. Okay, again, this is a little bit of a retread, but these are our previously participating jurisdictions in the plan. In 2018, these are the people who elected to participate. Now, I'm not 100% sure on the adoption status, whether they adopted the plan after it was done or not, but for the planning purposes, these are the folks that participated. Now, this is not an end-all, be-all list. We can add as many jurisdictions as we want to. So again, if there's other folks out there who didn't participate last time, that does not preclude them from participating this time. If you live in a city and your city's list is not up there, we'd love to have you join in the plan. Okay. When a jurisdiction participates, this is what we ask of them. We try to set the bar as low as possible so we can get as many jurisdictions in there. We're happy to have the one horse town or the big metropolis. It makes no difference to us. But we try to set that bar low so that everybody can get in. The first thing we ask is have somebody participate in these planning meetings. And we get that that's not always possible. We absolutely do. So if you can't, just let us know you can attend. And we'll reach out to you and we'll talk to you about what happened in the planning meeting so we can pull you along. We want you to provide that information because we're going to look at very jurisdictional specific things about you. And we are going to ask some questions that maybe you and your folks don't know, or nobody else but you and your folks know. But one of the things we're going to do differently from the last plan is this. We have a basis of information on each one of your jurisdictions. We're going to bring that basis of information to you and say, tell us what's changed, right? So all you're going to have to do is review that information and say, oh yeah, our building code has been updated, or oh yeah, now we've got a new nuisance ordinance, whatever it may be. You're not going to have to come up with a blank slate of ideas. We're going to guide you on the information we're looking for, and we're going to make it as easy as possible. The develop and review mitigation action items, that's going to be an important one. Again, what we're going to do is we're going to take your old actions that were identified in the old plan, and we're going to pull them forward. And we're going to ask each jurisdiction, what happened to these? In the 5 years since you identified them, have you completed them? If you haven't completed them, why didn't you complete them? Did you not have the money? Did you not have the staff? Did you not have the political support? Whatever it may be, why weren't they completed? And then the final question is going to be, do you still want to consider those? If someone handed your community a bag of money, is that still something that you would be interested in doing? And then we're going to say, hey, you got all these. Is there anything else that you'd like to consider doing? In the past 5 years, has something changed? Has technology changed? And you now got some great ideas about how you can mitigate against hazards? Let's add those actions in there as well. We're going to ask you to provide that feedback. Again, I'm going to write this plan, and I'm going to be really deep in it. And there's going to be stuff that I don't notice because I'm so deep in it and I've read it so many times, I just don't see it anymore. And so one of the things we're going to ask from you guys is read the plan and point out where I'm wrong. Right? Nothing makes me happier That's not true. It makes me okay to say when someone calls me and says, hey, W, why does this say this? That doesn't even make any sense. And I'll be like, I read that 18 times and I never noticed it. And I'll change it right there. So we want that feedback to make the plan stronger. And then we want you to formally adopt the plan. Okay. One of the things that we do first, and this is what I've been doing over the past, probably a week or so, is we look at you. Because we want to understand from the previous plan, what has changed? How have you changed? Because that's going to change the lens that we look at your hazards through. And we start looking at things like your population data. So we look at the 2000, 2010, 2020 census, and we try to determine what's happening to your populations. And I don't think it would surprise any of you to say that you are holding relatively steady, if not shrinking just a little bit. You're not dropping off a cliff, but you're also not getting thousands of new people moving in. So we look at it not only on the county level, but we look at it as the individual jurisdiction level as well, so we can understand what's happening with each of you. And then on the county level, we project out into the future, and we use state of California data to see what we think is going to happen in the future. And again, we see that we have sort of a slow decline in populations, and it's not earth-shattering. It's probably, in the order of 4,000 or 5,000 people that you're going to shrink over the next 40 years. So we look at that and we say, okay, this may change things about how we do stuff, because when you have fewer people, in theory, you may have a lower risk. Less people in the county, less people in danger to a wildfire. But on the flip side of that, when you have fewer people, you have a smaller tax base. And you may not have the economic resources to do some of the projects that you want to do because the money just doesn't exist. And so we try to look at this holistically and start shaping the plan based on this data. We look at vulnerable populations. I get it. I said that this is a point that we kind of hammer a little bit in the plan. So we try to start looking at your census data and determine what percentages do we have for vulnerable populations. And so we look at things like under 5, and we look at it on the county level and then on the individual jurisdictional level. We look at populations over 75, county, jurisdictional. Speaking language other than English at home, again, county and jurisdictional. Living below the poverty level. And you'll see over here that these numbers right here, this is your total population. So the blue bar is total population. The orange bar is the percentage of folks below the poverty level. And then finally, we look at folks with a disability. And what this does is this helps us understand a little bit more potential vulnerabilities. And that's one of the things we want to look at very much. We also look at housing data. What's happening with your housing? And we look at things like, how has it changed since 2000? So 2000, 2010, 2020 census. And then we look at it for total units for each one of your jurisdictions to understand what the trends are. And what we generally find is that your housing lags a little bit behind your population. If you've got a lot of people moving in, oftentimes you don't have enough housing to accommodate them. You've got to build more housing. If you're a static population, oftentimes your housing levels stay the same. And if you're shrinking, your housing level is going to go down. And so we look at that through the lens of vacancy rates. One of the things we can track is not only how many houses do you have, but what's the vacancy rate? And you'll see on the left-hand side for the county, we've got the total units versus occupied units. And then on the right-hand side for each one of our jurisdictions, we've got a graph there that says, this is your percentage vacancy rate. So again, what we look at is that tract population. Does that make sense? Do we have a lot of empty houses? Are they going to remain empty? If they remain empty, what's going to happen to them? So we're trying to understand all of this data to get your vulnerability. And then finally, with your housing data, we look at manufactured or mobile home stock, because manufactured homes are disproportionately at risk to hazards events. And it doesn't really matter what the hazard event is. If you live in a manufactured home, your risk goes up. And so what we want to understand is, what's the number, what's the percentage of mobile homes or manufactured homes that you have in the community? The higher the percentage, potentially the higher vulnerability. So this is what we look at when we're looking at data about you to try to understand initially, where are we going? We also take a look at agriculture. And with agriculture, we look, do you have a big agricultural base? And you do. You have a very big agricultural base. So we track things like the number of farms. Now you see that trend going down, but that's not necessarily alarming because what we've seen almost nationwide is with the number of farms, the smaller farms are being conglomerated into bigger farms. So the number of farms shrinking doesn't say, oh, your agricultural base is shrinking. In fact, what we start really looking at is the acres in agriculture. That tells a truer story. And you'll see that your acres in agriculture has held relatively steady, which indicates that you have a fairly big agricultural base and it hasn't changed. And then we look at the market value of your crops. So again, what's the market value of your agricultural products? And again, you'll see that that's been going up. And that matches too, because inflation and dollars and all this kind of stuff is getting more expensive. So this is becoming more and more and more a valuable part of your local economy. And then finally, we get to where we're going to ask you for some data with the changes in development. We can track fairly big infrastructure projects, big road projects. We can go to, Cal DOT and we can say, hey, what's happening with that? What big road projects are going in? But the local projects are harder for us to see. And so what we're going to ask you is, do you have any new city or county buildings or facilities that have been constructed? Again, because if they're new, they're meeting newer building codes. And so there's a bit better resiliency in there. Have you had any big renovations on any of your structures? Do you have any big projects completed or improved? We've got a 500 unit housing development going in on the west side of town. Those are the kind of things that we're looking for. Now, again, my knee-jerk reaction based on what we've seen for populations and things like that is that there hasn't been a lot of change, that things have held relatively steady over the past 5 years. But if it hasn't, that's the kind of things that we want to know. Okay, let's talk about hazards a little bit. Let's talk about how we're going to view the lens of your hazards here. And one of the things that we use and we rely on is the National Risk Index. What FEMA did is they created this big mapping program that takes a whole lot of data and combines it together and gives you something called your risk index. It takes a look at your expected annual losses, your social vulnerability, and your community resilience. And what it does is with the back end data that we pull into the plan, it also creates what we think are pretty useful maps. And one of the goals of this project is to make the hazard mitigation plan more accessible to the communities. It's great to dump a whole bunch of data in a plan, and most people do. It's almost better, I think, to put a map up there that explains what we're doing and why we're doing it and why things are the way they are. So you'll see that we've got social vulnerability here. This is the susceptibility of socially vulnerable groups to the impacts of hazards. And this is on a county basis. Now, the difference here is this. When we look at the county basis, what they're doing is they're comparing county to county. Because one of the other things we can do, and we think this is very useful for our participating jurisdictions and communities, is we can look at it on the census tract level. And now we can start looking at individual census tracts and say, does the hazard differ? Is there one community here that is more socially vulnerability? You'll see out near out on the west near the Klamath National Forest, it has a much higher social vulnerability than if we look to the east where we start getting relatively low. And so it allows us to start doing some differentiations here. And with the census blocks, with the census tracts, it compares census tract to census tract, not to county, but to census tract. And so we look at these maps, we look at our community resilience, which is our resilience to anticipated national hazards, so natural hazards. And again, you'll see that here's the county, but as we start getting down to the census block level, it tends to get a little bit different. What is our resilience? Now, again, we find this for a lot of reasons. But for county, you'll see the county was a much lighter color because a lot of the resources, especially in fairly rural counties like this, tend to rest with the county, not necessarily with the local jurisdictions. We look at expected annual losses. How bad can things get? What kind of money are we looking for every year based on natural hazards impacting us. And again, we do it on the county, on the census tract level. And what this does is all of this data eventually comes to this. This is your all hazards national risk index. And what it says is that for Siskiyou County, you were clearly relatively moderate compared to some of the other counties around you. It also tells you by census tract the same thing. And you'll see that the colors vary wildly here based on all the data that we put in before. But what it does is it allows us again to look at a community level basis and say things may be a little bit different for us. And here's why. Now, this is all very spectacular and kind of useful, but this is for all the natural hazards in there. What we also have the capability of doing using this is we can drill down to a hazard specific basis. So we can drill down and say, all right, what's our risk for an earthquake? Right? Where do we lie for an earthquake? And I picked a bad example here. I should have picked one that was fairly low. But again, it says, all right, we're relatively moderate for earthquake. And on the census tract level, the same thing applies. So being able to drill down to our identified hazards, again, allows us to say, in totality, here's our potential risk, but specifically based on the hazard, here's our potential risk. And they vary. And so it allows us to prioritize what hazards we're worried about. One of the other things we also look at when we're determining your hazards and talking about your hazards from the get-go is your disaster declarations, your emergency declarations, your fire declarations. And so what we do is we go back to 1953 with your presidentially declared disasters and we say, how many have impacted you? Not only how many have impacted you, but what did they impact you with? And what was the individual assistance available? And was there any mitigation funding? Remember the hazard mitigation grant program? After a disaster, a percentage gets sequestered into that fund. What mitigation grants came available? And you'll see, and I don't think that this is going to surprise anybody, but the majority of your hazards are severe storms and flooding. You get a winter storm outlier every once in a while and fires. And I think that probably checks out with most of you. You would say, yeah, that's what knocks us down most of the time. That makes sense. We also do it for your emergency declarations. So I'm sorry, this is your presidentially declared disasters since 1953. And what you should notice there is that there's some pretty dead periods there, and maybe you get one every once in a while. But if you start coming into the late 2010s up to now, that frequency starts to increase, which again alarms us a little bit because these things tend to be happening more often. And so we should be a little bit more worried about it. We look at emergency declarations. And then we look at a big one for you, fire management assistance grants, FMAGs. These are for big fires that happen, and you've had a bunch. And so again, this checks out with what I think most of us are worried about. I don't think there's a person here that's not saying, hey, wildfire. Yeah, I'm a little bit worried about that, right? It checks out with what we're looking for. And so based on all of this, what we do then is we take a look at your hazards. And this is the hazard discussion. And what we did is we said, okay, let's look at these hazards. The first thing we did is we looked at the state of California plan and said, what hazards are in there? And then we looked at your 2018 plan and said, was that hazard included in the 2018 plan? And now we're thinking for our 2024 plan, what hazards do we want in there? And you'll see that I've got some rationale and some notes by some of these, but this is an open discussion, right? This isn't me telling you what the hazards are because that's not how this works. This is a community effort. And so you'll see that we've got dam failure here. Now, we were just talking about dam failure. You have, according to our initial research, 6 high hazard dams, and you have 3 significant hazard dams. High hazard dams are dams that if they fail, are probably going to kill some people. That's just a rough nutshell of it. There's all sorts of other things in the definition, but that's why it's a high hazard dam, because its failure will likely kill somebody. You have 6 of those in here. We have, for 2 of those, what we call emergency action plans. Those are inundation areas. If the dam fails, what's it going to swallow up? how many people were in there, what kind of stuff is in there. But we were talking about it earlier on in the fact that many of your high hazard dams are probably in the next round not going to be classified as high hazard dams because they're not holding much water anymore. In fact, I think that some of your high hazard dams may be being taken down, right? And if that's the case, one of the things we want to look at is dam failure now a big concern for us? Is that a hazard we want to put in the plan? We can look at drought. Now, I think that drought is probably a hazard that should be put in the plan because what does drought exacerbate? Wildfires, right? So I think that drought is a very big concern. And despite all the rains, I think that it's going to be a future concern. Earthquake. You're in an earthquake area. That's just the way it is, right? There's no moving on from that. Here we are. Now, earthquakes don't happen ridiculously frequently. They're what we call a low probability, high impact hazard. So they don't happen often, but when they do, they can really do some damage. We can look at extreme temperatures. Now, extreme temperatures weren't included in your last plan. It's worth considering, should they be included in this plan? And when we say extreme temperatures, in this day and age, which makes me sound like I'm 80, but in this day and age, we're not really looking at extreme cold. We're looking at extreme heat. We can talk about flood. You guys have repeated flood occurrences. That's just the way it is. Whether it be riverine flood or flash flooding or urban flooding, it happens. Landslide's an interesting one. You have favorable conditions for landslides. You've got hills, right? And hills slide. The frequency of landslides is very hard to determine because there's not really a clearinghouse of landslide data. So how often do they happen? And when they do happen, maybe more importantly, what do they do? If something slides in the middle of nowhere, who cares? But if somebody slides in the middle of town, that becomes a bigger deal. Levee failure. Levee failure is an interesting one because it wasn't included in your old plan. And we kind of looked and we did initial research. We said, hey, I see why it wasn't included because it's a low impact. We did some initial research and we determined that for the levees, all of the levees here in the county, 86 people live behind them. And out of those 86 people, they live in buildings that are up to $9 million. But behind those levees, no critical infrastructure, no endangered species, no tribal entities. And so we said, yeah, that makes sense. Maybe that's why that wasn't included, because a levee failure doesn't have a big move the needle impact. We're not saying that it can't happen and it can't do damage, but what we are saying is that there's very few communities, and in fact, very few people within those communities that would be impacted by a levee failure. Sea level rise doesn't count. You don't have an ocean. Well, you don't have an ocean here. Severe weather, absolutely. When we talk about severe weather, we talk about in general thunderstorm weather. So that's high winds, lightning, those kind of things. We think that, yeah, that's something that you may be worried about. Snow avalanche is a weird one. You don't actually, and I think I'm sorry, I've got a no on there, but it is. You have it no last time. I don't think that you guys have a very big avalanche hazard. I'm not saying that it doesn't occur, but what I am saying that when it does occur, it tends to be in very remote areas that don't impact a lot of folks. And you have to have very special conditions for an avalanche in general, and this is roughly, you got to have a slope that's between 30 and 45%. Anything lower than that, it doesn't tend to slide. Anything higher than that, the snow doesn't build up, and so it's not holding to slide. So again, yes, no, maybe. Subsidence, land subsidence wasn't in your old plan. I don't necessarily think it needs to be in this one. Land subsidence really needs two things to happen for it to occur, and these are rough generalities. You need something called karst topography underneath, karst rock underneath, which is limestone. Add water to limestone, it gets super porous, sinkhole. Or you need a extensive underground mining network. An extensive underground mining network, again, you've got these big voids in there, settles, collapses, sinkhole. We did a little bit of initial research. I couldn't find any incidences of subsidence in the county. Now, again, this doesn't mean that they don't occur. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying I couldn't find any big ones. Tsunami, again, not a geographic risk for you. Volcano, well, there's one, right? Now, again, volcano is an interesting one because geologically speaking, for the time that we're all alive, why that shouldn't blow off, right? Depending on what happens and how you look at it, every 600 years is kind of what they're saying that it should blow. We're 200 years into that cycle, so we got a good 400 years before it should go. I'm not taking odds on whether it's going to blow off tomorrow or not. I just won't take the odds on that. But again, it's certainly a known hazard because you can look out your door and see it. And then wildfire. I think absolutely yes on wildfire. And then we have in your plan, I'm sorry, these are the previous plan rankings. So what they did in the last plan is they ranked the hazards and said, this is what we consider to be our concern. So you'll see severe weather and wildfire were the top ones, followed by flood, earthquake, drought, volcano, landslide, dam failure. And I think in our initial research, that pretty much checks out, right? Based on the events that we've seen, based on the presidentially declared disasters, based on the fires that you've had, this kind of checks out. The only weird one is the severe weather. And again, you know, we may noodle with that. I would say that wildfire is squarely a number one, right? That's what I would say. Probably followed closely by flood and drought. But we can noodle with that. And then in your plan last time, you had these. They were called other hazards of interest. And these were other things that people came up with and said, hey, you know, these are hazards we may be worried about. Air quality and smoke pollution, energy shortage, fish disease, hazardous materials, noxious weeds. What I would say to you is this. If someone handed your community bag of money and said, go make things safer in the long term, would you consider using that bag of money to mitigate against any of those? Could you mitigate against any of those? That's the consideration, right? Now, what we've done is this. We've created a Google Form survey. So it's online and live right now. And in fact, I'll show it to you at the end of this. But what it does is it asks you a series of yes, no questions and then gives you a couple open-ended questions. And what it does is for every hazard that we listed in there, it says, should we include this in the plan? Right? What do you think? Is this a hazard worth writing about and including in the plan? Is this a hazard that if someone gave my community a bag of money, we would consider spending that bag of money on mitigating against that hazard? And it asks about those previous ones. It asks about noxious weeds. Are you kept up at night and worried about the noxious weed problem? And would you like to do something about it? There's no wrong answer. But what we want to do is from the outset, we want to frame what hazards we're putting in the plan and what hazards we're going to mitigate against. So this survey is going to be open for about 10 days for anybody to fill out. Okay, what are our next steps? This is a rough timeline. We know that your plan expires in August. And one of the things we want to do is we want to try to get it approved and ready to go as soon as we possibly can. But this is a pretty big lift effort, right? I mean, it's a pretty big lift effort to pull all of this data together and write these big sections of plan. We're going to work as diligent as we can and as hard as we can to get this information through. But this is our rough timeline. We're going to start drafting the plan. Well, we've already started drafting it right now, truthfully. But July, we're going to have pulled much of the data and we're going to start writing things and then we're going to start soliciting input from you. We'll do our second meeting probably in early October, maybe before that. It depends on how things are writing and how we're getting data from you. But the second meeting is going to focus on our hazard mitigation action items. And we're going to talk to you about your old actions. We're going to talk them through. We're going to talk about what you want to do and how you want to do it. We're going to have some public reviews. We're going to have some final public meetings, and then we're going to submit it to Cal OES, the Office of Emergency Services. And they're going to review it. Now, I will tell you that the odds are fairly high that they will come back and say, we'd like some changes. That's their job, right? They will probably come back and say, we'd like a couple of changes here or there. It's usually nothing sweeping because we try to adhere as closely as we can to all of the regulations that we need to. But they'll come back and say, hey, we'd like you to do this. And we'll say happily. And then they will submit it on to FEMA. Once it's with FEMA, FEMA has 45 business days to review and approve the plan. Now, they will say that they have 45 days, but if there are exigent circumstances, emergencies, whatever it is, that period can increase out whatever they need to. FEMA will do one of two things. They will say, we like how the plan looks. We just submitted a plan to Nevada. went through great, they said, hey, we like how it looks, feeling good about this. Or they may come back and say, hey, you know what, we'd like a couple of changes. And we'll happily do it. And we'll do it quickly, because again, those changes are never anything sweeping. They tend to be little things, and that's learning to work with those folks to say, okay, what are you guys really hitting on? And depending on the reviewer you get, and depending on how it's reviewed, sometimes that changes a little bit. Some reviewers are very important on this, and others are very important on this. And so we learn to work with them, and we try to provide them as much information as we can early so that they know the product they're getting. Once that's done, we're done. And then all we have to do is adopt the plan for each of our jurisdictions, and we're done for 5 years. That's how long this plan lasts for. So those are the rough steps we're going to take. Now, again, this will change because we're at the kickoff meeting today. We're at the beginning of the process. We're going to try to accelerate. We may hit some bumps, but this gives us a rough idea of time period. Okay, that's what I got for you. I told you I would not take up the whole time, but what questions do you all have? What can I answer for you? What concerns do you have, both online and in the room? Is there anything you'd like to talk about?
Would this include infrastructure, like their water lines that are?
Yeah. So again, that comes back to the idea of the mitigation projects, right? So one of the projects you may say is, hey, we want to replace some water infrastructure. And they're going to say, why do you want to replace it? And you would say, we are worried about the age of the infrastructure, it failing, and it not being allowing us to work against drought or wildfire, right? So we want to frame it in the right way and say, yeah, we've got aging infrastructure. Here's why we want to replace it so that we have a long-term sustainable fix for hazards that may impact us.
In your process, are you gonna be only updating the Siskiyou County portion of the LHMP, or how are you gonna approach the annexes for each jurisdiction?
Yeah, so we'll update the annexes for sure. You can see from like our population data and stuff like that, everything we do for the county, in rough terms, we do for the jurisdictions as well. Now, one of the things that we'll say is that in the last plan, and this is no knock against it, but one of the things we want to guard against is your last plan was 500 something pages. It's big. And we found that there was a lot of duplication in there, a lot of stuff that maybe was, here's the stuff for the county, here's the same stuff for the jurisdiction or the city. It's roughly the same stuff. So what we want to try to do is we want to try to make the plan more usable. And so we'll simplify a little bit, but it'll be the same process. We should have the same annexes for each one of the jurisdictions so that they have their own pull-out sheets that they can use.
And so you'll be drafting those in cooperation with the jurisdictions, or are you gonna expect the jurisdictions to draft their own?
Yeah, so no, I'm not going to expect the jurisdictions to draft their own. What we are going to do is we're going to pull the information from the old annexes last time, and we're going to say, tell us what's changed, right? Because we've got most of the information in there. So we're not going to give you a blank sheet and say, fill it out. We're going to say, here's the information from before, and it's the same information we want. Now, tell us what's changed about this information. Have you got a new code? Have you got a new ordinance? Do you have a new, heck, I don't know. But again, it won't be a blank slate. It'll be a review and revise versus come up with out of thin air what you need. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That easy, I hope, or easier?
It's fine.
The
The last plan's just not good.
Yeah.
So I don't really wanna look at the last plan
Gotcha.
for the jurisdiction I represent.
Sure. And who do you represent? Who do you
City of Puerto Rico.
Okay, so one of the things we're going to try to do again is make it more usable and more information friendly, right? One of the things I'll tell you is that in the old plan, there's a whole bunch of the history of the like Puerto Rico was founded in by this and this and this. In my humble opinion, that stuff doesn't need to be in there. It has nothing to do with hazard mitigation planning. What we do want to put in there is this: how is Wairika changed, right? What has happened to you? What are your potential vulnerabilities? So we want to talk about things like your critical infrastructure. Do you have any, where are your fire stations? Where are your police stations? Where is your emergency operations center? And is any of that in known, identified, potentially specific hazard areas? So we want to look at that. We want to look at, again, then your mitigation action items. If someone handed your community a bag of money, how are you going to make things safer? That's the kind of stuff that we want to look at for our communities. There's a lot of stuff in there that we think is superfluous to the plan. How about that? So we want to make it leaner. and more useful to you. That's the idea. Now, I will say that in your old plan, you had a whole bunch of questions of, do you have a building code? So does Wairika have a building code?
Yeah.
Okay, it was yes back then too. Do you have a floodplain ordinance? Can't build in floodplains.
We do have a floodplain ordinance, but it doesn't prohibit construction.
Okay, but again, yes, you do with some modifications to it. Do you have a community wildfire protection plan?
Yes.
Okay, those are the questions that we want to ask because that speaks to your resilience. And that's what we want to show, what resilience you have. And then we want to also highlight potentially some of the gaps there. For example, do you have I'm trying to think of a good plan. You've got a fire plan, so that's good. That's a big one. Do you have, are all your buildings earthquake retrofitted?
No.
Okay, that's a gap. And so what we want to do is we want to say, hey, look, that's a fairly straightforward fix. Maybe we want to identify that as a mitigation action items because technically right now, if there was an earthquake, your buildings aren't retrofitted. So maybe that's an action we want to say for Wairika in particular that says, this is a great action that you can take to make your community safe. That's what we're driving at.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're on board with that? That's okay?
No, I'm aware of what an LHMP is.
No, I'm not saying.
I get it.
Yeah. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to put all that old the fluff from the old plan in there. We want to make it leaner, tighter, more useful to you and your team.
Okay.
That's the idea. Other questions?
We have a question online from Steve Indicator.
Hey, Steve.
Hey, how's it going?
Great, thank you.
I have a question about, so how do you want us to reach out about being on the planning committee for the HMP from each jurisdiction?
Fantastic question. Thank you. So we're going to ask that all communications go through your folks, your OES. So in particular, Owen. And I think Owen is going to make an email and a contact information available. One of the things is that we want complete visibility to your team. And so we'll ask you just throw your hand up and say, hey, I'm happy to be part of this program. Put me on the team, coach. And that'll go to Owen and then that'll come to us and we'll include that in the thing. And then we'll start looping you in on future events.
Got it. Thank you. And then, sorry, just to follow up with Juliana's questions. What is like the specific, I wasn't completely clear on how the jurisdictions are how you're gonna work with the jurisdictions on updating their annexes. Like I already have edits for Dunsmuir, and so I'd rather give those to you sooner than waiting for you guys to reach out to me.
Yeah.
So how do we do that?
Yeah, again, just submit it through Owen. Anything that you've got that you've made current, you can submit through Owen. We'll take it and then we'll put it into the, not new format, but we'll bring it into the new plan and pull it forward. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
One of the things that I'm curious about is several of the statistics that you were showing aren't taking into account reality as far as like population.
Mhm.
We have a ghost population of probably 8 to 10,000 that's out in an area of the county.
Mhm.
And the hazard that, at least from my view, that's created by that community is fairly substantial.
The risk to the community or the hazard created, potential hazard created
I
by them?
would say both.
Okay.
In my view, but the other stat that I that's interesting is the agriculture stat. Because I would suspect that the numbers you had was legal agriculture. And there is a very extensive non-legal agriculture. And that's something that has grown by significant amounts since the last hazard mitigation plan. But where do you get the hard, cold stats and facts and for that? Just curious what your thoughts are on.
Yeah, no, the answer is you can't get specific data on that because when you look at a transient population or an undocumented population of any kind, it's hard to determine those numbers with any accuracy because by nature they change fairly substantially, maybe with the season, maybe with who knows what. And so it's hard to quantify that. Now we can write that into the plan about there being a big transient or undocumented population in the county. but it would be very hard to quantify what those numbers were. And more importantly, it would be hard to quantify what's happening with them because we would have to look at old data and say, you know, in 2010, the transient population or the undocumented population or whatever we want to call it was this, and now it's this. And so it's growing, shrinking. It's hard to determine what's happening with that. But that doesn't mean that we can't write that into the plan and say that we recognize that this is a potential population problem. And quite truthfully, we may call it something like they're an underserved population in many ways because they are not receiving services or whatever it may be. So we can absolutely write that in there. And what we rely on is data from you guys is to, you know, do you have any numbers? Does Wairika have any numbers on, you know, transient populations and things like that? And if they do, we want to pull that forward and say, yeah, we've got the data and we got it from the local jurisdictions.
So I think on that, it's a great point. To your point, FEMA's not gonna hand us a bag to mitigate that.
No.
And that's something that we can write in and we can have really like what you were saying, it is more of an underserved, if anything, for us as a community. We know that we have to reach out. There is a language barrier. There are certain points for us as touch points for the county that we need to address. But FEMA's not gonna hand us a bag of money to say, oh, we'll go fix that problem. That's a county problem that we're gonna address. Like,
Yeah.
And then we'll tie in a little bit more on that. And some of it is gonna be law enforcement sensitive. Just kind of talking with the sheriff on that.
Yeah. Again, it's the idea of it's hard to, you know, without hard data points, it's hard to write exactly what's happening with it. But again, we also won't say, hey, it doesn't exist. I mean, I can put our head in the sand. We'll say, we recognize that we've got a fairly big, and the concern is, especially for some of your hazards, if you've got a big undocumented population or transient population and they are in remote areas and they're lighting a campfire, it's a concern because again, it's a big wildfire risk, and because it's a remote area, response time may be impacted. And so again, it's a big concern. And so, you know, the illegal agriculture is another good point. With the illegal agriculture, there's no way to really to quantify it, right? I mean, I'm presuming that they're saying, you know, you have illegal marijuana farms, and it's hard to quantify what the dollar figure on that, and it's hard to quantify what's happening with them. And it's also hard to quantify what kind of resources they're using, like what kind of water are they pulling. It's really hard to that black market, gray area, gray market kind of stuff. It's really hard to quantify that. And so it's not that we can't recognize it, it's just that we can't in any way, shape, or form prognosticate what's happening with it.
Yeah, my concerns are more on with the chemicals that are being found out there and what impact they're having in the long term on the communities, the areas. You've got infrastructure for some cities that are running right through the middle of these areas.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm glad to hear, you know, no burying the head in the sand, because to me, that's a significant risk that's sitting there.
Yeah, 100%. And so when we look at specific hazards, we can certainly write in there about that specific risk. Like if I'm thinking about an undocumented or transient population, and I'm thinking about your hazards, I'm not really worried about earthquake with them. I'm not really worried about flood with them, but I'm colossally worried about their potential impact on wildfire. Right, I'm worried about there being a meth lab and things going wrong, and it's in the remote area and it's starting a wildfire. So there are some hazards where that becomes more relevant. That population becomes more relevant because of the potential impact on it. Yes, sir.
Kind of in that same vein, in the summertime, our population fluctuates substantially. I noticed on Dunsmuir, we have a 30% vacancy rate. Well, most of those are second homes.
Right.
So then, you know, on weekends and holidays and stuff like that, the population in the South County area increases substantially.
Right.
And so like, how are we gonna manage that when it comes to like potential, because it's during fire season, so then we have to consider evacuation and looking at all of the things like, you know, how many beds do we really need? Because yes, our population says 1,700, but we have 4,000 people in town this weekend, right?
Right.
And so there's a big flux in what that looks like. in the South County area, during the summer use.
Yeah, so one of the things that we want to maybe do to address that is we'd say, hey, look, when we look at our mitigation action items, how do we address that through that long term? And that would be a potential education thing that we want to look at is we've got this population that comes in, that's second homeowners, they're there for the weekend, they're having a good time. They're not really worried about anything. One of the actions we may want to take is provide education to them that if a wildfire does come up, where do you go? Right? How do you evacuate? What do you do with that? And so again, remember through the lens, we're looking for those long-term actions that we can take to make things safer for that long term. And so that would be one of the actions that we would consider. And we can certainly, in your particular annex, say, we've got a big influx of population seasonally. And how does that impact us? How does that impact our vulnerability? Because you would say, well, during the summer, our vulnerability goes up because we've got a bigger population that may be less educated on the hazards that can impact us. And so that becomes a problem. And then the problem is, then what you say is, how do we solve that problem? So yeah, absolutely. We can do that jurisdictionally specific and say, you know, we're a little bit different and here's how we're a little bit different. And that's the kind of stuff that we'll be relying on you and your teams to do in that, you know, I don't know that. Right? I don't know what Wairika's, transient or underserved populations are. I just don't know that stuff. And so that's what I want to work with you on to say, when we're writing your specific annex, let's write it for you. Right? Technically, we don't have to do these annexes. Right? This is one of the few, California is one of the few states where this really happens. In other states, the jurisdictions in the county, they're all treated the same. They're all written into the same plan and the risk is enumerated in the same plans. For you guys, you have your specific annexes, which gives you the opportunity to really make it about you. And so that's the kind of stuff that we want to put in there. Hey, we've got a huge swell summertime population, or we've got a huge indigent population, or maybe not huge, but within the city borders, we've got an indigent population. And this is what it does to us. That's what we're looking for. That's the local data we're looking for. Other questions? All right.
So Julie Titus online's asking, are you aware of the county-wide interagency CWPP with all the tools and mitigations regarding wildfire?
Yeah, so we haven't started going down that research, but absolutely we'll look at that kind of stuff. One of the things we're going to ask you for is plans, policies, procedures, the community wildfire protection plan. Again, I'm presuming that the county has got one and that jurisdictions have got either part of that or their own. And so, yes, that's absolutely one of the things we'll pull out because usually those things have got great mapping and a great understanding of what the risk is. And so we'll absolutely rely on those to pull forward.
And Matt, and we'll start sending now that we've kicked off.
Yep.
Basically, the emails are open, so we're
Yes.
gonna start flooding your emails, and just like the community, we'll have the local hazard mitigation page up.
Yep.
We wanted to kick this thing off, and once that's probably today or tomorrow morning, we'll have our page up, and it'll have all the emails and addresses for you as the public to start pushing us information.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things with the survey that we created, the online initial survey, is one of the questions in there is, where do you live? What city do you live in, or what's the nearest city you live in? And when you're answering those questions, when you're answering, should these hazards be included, it also helps us understand on a community basis what the hazard should be, because it may not be blanket. Right? If you're not living near Mount Shasta, if you're clear on the other side of the county, an eruption of Mount Shasta may or may not impact you. It may or may not be worrisome to you. Right? If the cloud blows out to the east, you may not be worried about it. Now, if it's a big explosion, that's ridiculous patently, but you get the idea, right? We want to understand what those local level risks are as well. And again, when we're doing this, we look at the NRI, the National Risk Index, and we look at it by census tract as well, so we can start trying to dial that stuff in. All right, well, my final question is to you guys. What the heck are you still doing here? Get out of here. Thank you for coming. I really do appreciate your time today. Oh, I should show one more slide. That's me. So that's my phone number. That's my email address. You can always text me, email me, call me. The only time I don't answer my phone is when I'm doing a presentation like this. So You're welcome to reach out and talk to me. I'm genuinely happy to talk about really anything hazard mitigation planning related. So if you want to dive into specifics, if you want to talk specifically about your jurisdiction, if you want to, talk about the shape of the plan, I'm genuinely happy to do so. Now get the heck out of here.